Hello, Shirley Adams here with the 9th program in Series 3 of the Sewing Connection to give you a new dimension in sewing. We're going to start with a plain jewel neckline, then create a collar. But before I show you how to do that from scratch, I'm going to show you how to get a little bit of a head start by taking an existing coat. And if I wanted to wear this taupe coat with that purple dress underneath, I might want to do something to coordinate them a little bit to make them look like one outfit. So that something might be this. I'll just put the coat up here on the table and stretch it out so that I can trace this collar. I can trace it better on the back side, I think. So I'm just going to put this collar down on some paper and trace around it. And after I have this traced, to actually cut this out and use it as a pattern, and I've just got a straight line I see there across the neck, so I'll make a little mark here and a little mark there, and know that all I have to do then with a straight edge, here's one, is connect those lines, and I've got it going. So I shall connect, and then to cut this out I would add a 5/8" seam allowance, of course, all around. Go ahead and measure it and get it real accurate, which I'm not doing, I'm just drawing this. Cut out 2 layers of that and a layer of interfacing and cut it out of that dress fabric. And then what I have done additionally, as I stitched all this together and top stitched it around, I put in little loop button holes, little button loops in 4 places. And in corresponding places inside the neckline of this coat, I have put buttons. So now it just buttons on nicely. And this is just a quick way to make a unified whole outfit out of separate pieces by adding this little piece here. So I'll button another one here and put another. I rarely wear this, therefore those buttons are in there all the time, but I never notice them. So they aren't going to bother you. You could do this with several different colors on one coat and make a nice little outfit then to go with the dress, and it looks like it all belongs together. So this is a head start program that I've done here. But if you're going to do this from scratch, what you're going to need is a pattern, a front and a back, for whatever garment it is that you're going to be making this collar. For instance, you probably have some jewel necklines in blouses. And if you wanted to add a collar to those, you would just forget to put the facing on and add the collar instead. So what is the standard is this suit up here. This is a full roll collar. On this blouse is another one. It's very similar, but it's a full roll collar. And the way you make a full roll collar is to take the bodice front and the bodice back. And I'm using a child's garment in this instance just because they're smaller and they're easier to work with in this space, so it's easier for you to see. Now I want you to notice some similarities right away, and let me tell you why. Notice that on the bodice front, the neckline is down about 2 inches lower than it is on the bodice back. And the reason for this is because your chest comes up at one angle and then your neck goes out at a different angle. So this is why a neckline in front is always lower. In back you don't have those 2 angles. Your back slants up and it just keeps going up the back of your neck. So it's only one angle, therefore that neck back can be higher. If you have this front neckline up too high, it feels like you're choking and it's very, very uncomfortable. So it must come to that standard place where those 2 planes converge, where it comes up your chest and down your neck, and where they meet, that's where your standard neckline is. Well, to get this going, what we'll have to do is overlap these shoulders, front and back, and I'm going to overlap them 1 1/4 inches because 2 5/8" seams, one for each, makes 1 1/4 inches, so I have it overlapped that much. And I'll just put a couple of pins there to hold it together on this end and another pin on the other end, and have them all as one piece, and then we can start doing some measuring and make some real quick collars. So this is true whether it's blouse, coat, jacket, sweater, anything you have, any kind of a pattern. All you need is the neckline, and then you can make a collar for it. So with this little neckline all taped together, what I want to do is measure from the center front over to the shoulder point. So I'll measure this, and not on the cutting line, because we're going to have a seam there, and it's the seam line that fits around your standard neckline. So I'm going to measure this right on the 5/8 line from the center front and come around to the shoulder point, and I see there that it is exactly 3 1/4 inches. Let's both remember that, 3 1/4, and then I'll come on around, and when I come all the way to the center back, I see that what I have here is about 5 3/4. So 3 1/4 and 5 3/4 to the center back. I'll just draw that here on the paper. So if here is the center front, I'm doing this upside down. I'm really great, as you already know from former programs, at upside down things, but I hope you can see what it is. So here's front, and if I go 3 1/4 inches, that's right here, and that is shoulder. Is this the right direction for an S, hopefully? And then if I go over here to 5 3/4, right to there is the back. Okay, so this little bit here is half a neckline. I think I'll just make this twice as much so that we have a full neckline. And while I'm drawing this extra line, look at what the comparisons are. As we go from the front to the shoulder, notice how this is a bigger space, and from the shoulder to the back, it's a smaller space. And remember, that's because your front neckline is down lower. This is why you have that spacing. So here's another shoulder, and here's another front over here. It goes all the way around the neck. Okay, what we have here is the neckline of a standard collar. That's all we need, just this measurement, and we can make a collar from this. Now what you need additionally is something around the outside here. If we need to make it two-dimensional instead of just one straight line, that something else is going to be the style line. Now you're the designer, you decide where you want the style line. I'm going to decide right at the center back about how high I want that collar to be. And let's say, oh, about that looks right, whatever that is. Measure it if you want to, if you don't know how high you want a collar to stand up. Because with every standard collar, there is a stand going up the back, and then it folds over. So there's a stand and a fall. And that's what I'm building right here, that stand and fall. So as I have the stand up here, this is as high as I want it. Now if you have kind of a short neck, things that are standing up kind of high bother you. They get in your way. Every time you move your head, it's hitting there. So go through your closet and find a collar that you really like, that feels just right on you, that feels very comfortable, and measure how high that stand is. And you might want to build yours then on an original collar the same way. So here's how high this one's going to be. Well, the fall has to be about the same size because it's going to cover it up. So I see that I have mine 1.5 inches. So 3 inches out here is where the fall is. Now what I still have remaining that's empty here is the style line. And here's where you decide what you want. You're the designer. In some fashion periods, we'd have the style line coming out in real long pointed collars out here. Other times we wouldn't wear that garment at all because it's so out of date. Because of that big long pointed collar, we simply couldn't wear it. So the style line changes as the fashion picture changes from year to year and decade to decade. Right now you'd probably see something that looks about like this. It's just a slight point. It isn't quite squared off here. It comes out a little bit more to a point. So this is kind of standard right now. Then additionally, something that we almost always see, if you can look back in your mind's eye and picture any of your pattern pieces, any of your collar patterns that you've been working with, rarely is that neckline a straight line. Almost always it slants up a little bit at the center front. And the reason for that is because if you have this standard neckline here, rarely do you wear it buttoned. You almost always wear it open. And so this is building a convertible collar. It will go gracefully around your neck, either open or closed. If you just start here at the shoulder point and work yourself up, about 1/2 inch out here. So with this 1/2 inch out here, and of course since I'm now in a longer line, I'm just going to shorten it a speck and say this is my center front right here. So now we have a collar here that would work out just right. In order to complete it, I would probably just fold it in half. I'll cut this apart and fold it in half so that I can cut the whole collar, and both sides will be the same so that I don't have to worry about them coming out in different places. Okay, right here, and I'll go ahead and cut out that collar, and while I'm cutting, I better add a seam allowance to it. So now we have a 5/8 seam allowance in addition to what we originally had there. And here's my collar pattern. Remember this when you lose the collar pattern from some pattern, and instead of going out to buy a new one, you really can just create another one on your own if you'll measure that neckline. So here we have a standard collar. Now, something that is just a little bit of a break off from this, a little spin off from this standard collar, is if you can picture a man's shirt. Here I have a woman's blouse, but it's the same thing. This is a two-piece collar, and it's the very same collar as I just built, but it is in two pieces. See how there's a stand here and a fall there, and they aren't all connected. There's a seam in the middle of them. It fits around the neck a little bit more snugly, and so men's shirt collars are frequently this way, or possibly usually this way. Notice how that goes sort of standardly in an even width all the way around, and then it kind of slopes down to the center front. So I'm going to simulate that in this by drawing here from the back, and I'll sort of round it around to the center front here. And we do the same on the other side. Now this won't measure exactly the same, but I'm not too worried about it. Actually, if I wanted both sides to be the same, I would just go ahead and fold that in half and work it that way. Okay, what I would need to do then is cut this off. Maybe I better fold it in half. Make sure it comes out right. Okay, there we go. And here I am on the wrong side, so it's not going to come out right after all. There we have it. So now both of them are the same. What we'd have to add to this in order to make this a collar with this is when we cut out the two pieces, where we cut them apart here and here, we just have to add a seam allowance to each. Add 5/8 to each part, sew them back together again, and it just seems to fit your neck a little bit better that way. But we can also discard this if we want to. This is the fall of the collar, the edge part. We can discard this and just use this neck part, just use the stand of the collar, and what we have then is a turtleneck collar. Here's one, or I don't mean a turtleneck, I mean a mandarin collar. Here's one, and this was made in that very same way. This was made just by using the stand of a collar and making two layers of it, putting a seam all around. This one comes way over and includes the front buttons. It doesn't end at the center front. The center front would be right here under the button. This one goes a little beyond. So to make it do that, I'll just trace this and show you what this pattern would look like. Which was the neckline? By now I'm trying to decide. It was the one down at the bottom here. Okay, here's the neckline right here, center back. What I have done with this, instead of just leaving it right here at the center front, I have measured from the center front on out to the extension, which is this little bit here, about a ½ inch probably, that comes from the center of the collar out to the edge, out to this folded edge here. That's the extension. That's the room for the buttons and buttonholes. And so if I would measure that on almost any blouse, it would be about a ½ inch. On a coat, it would probably be 5/8 to 3/4 to even larger if they called for larger buttons, because the extension always depends on the size of the button. So if I would add that ½ inch here so that I could put the buttons in, then that just means here at the center front on both edges, add a ½ inch. That's the center front. Add a ½ inch for the extension. I better add another ½ inch, 5/8 of an inch then for the seam allowance, and here's how I'm going to make it. The collar that you see on that blouse would look about like this, and it comes down here to the center front, and then I'd have to add the extra. So that easily you can build a mandarin collar, and with the greatest of ease. It works out nicely. Here again, if you have kind of a short neck, a high mandarin collar is going to bother you a lot. I wear a lot of high collars because they feel fine on me. But if your neck is shorter, make sure that you cut it down, and it would just be trimming off some of this style line up here on top. That's what you would want to eliminate if you don't want your collar to stand so high. So a mandarin collar is just every bit as simple as that full roll collar. All we're doing is using the stand of the collar, cutting off the fall, and using what remains here. There are times when even you can do a little tuxedo collar. If, for instance, right here from the shoulder front, or from the shoulder up to the front, if right about here I would decide to put a little sail, like a little sailboat up here, that goes like this on both sides. If I had this all cut out, and if I would then fold that little sail down, it would look just like the collar. I'll give it a seam allowance. It would look just like the collar on a tuxedo shirt. So this is another little simple thing that you can add. And I'll cut it off on this side. And this would just fold down then so that when you see it on the garment, it's a stand-up collar basically, but it has this little sail coming down to look like a tuxedo collar. Easy? You can do that? Okay, so let's move on and think of what other kind of collars we sometimes see on garments besides these that you've already seen. What we haven't done yet is a bias collar, and these bias collars are very nice to have on some garments. I'm wearing a bias collar. This is also kind of a turtleneck that I have on, but actually it's cut on the bias. And it just, if you have it in woven fabric especially, it makes it more comfortable. It moves. I have it in knit fabric, so it wouldn't matter that much. But a bias collar I have back here, and this one's also in a knit. Could have been in a straight one. So this bias collar is comfortable. It's sort of a stand-up collar too, but it is bias. And the fact that it's bias, it bends more easily, it stretches, it conforms to your neck shape and your movements a little bit more easily. So this is another possibility. That bias collar is almost always just a straight piece. It's just a matter of measuring the neckline. And after you have that neckline measured, we already knew what our neckline was. It was what, 5 3/4 times 2. You can either multiply that or you can just fold your tape measure in half, and it comes out to be about 11 1/2 is what that full length would be around the neckline of this child's dress. Around yours it would probably be closer to 14 or 15, somewhere between 13 1/2 and 15 anyway is probably what it would be on a woman's neckline. So that much, all we'd have to do is measure that amount, 11 1/2 here, decide how high it wants to be. Now both the one that you saw on the red knit dress here and the one I'm wearing are kind of gathered at the back. They're both zipped in back, and they're sort of gathered on that zipper. So what that means is originally it was made quite high, twice this height, and then gathered down in back. The one I have on is only one layer, and it has a little hem at the very top. But it's kind of the same idea. It was just a pretty high collar. Nobody's neck is this high. It was meant to just crush down in place then so that it gives a soft look. So with this one being 11 1/2 inches, I would guess that the one I'm wearing might be, about this high. And then we would just use, of course, L squares would be good. If you don't have an L square, by the way, you don't have to run out and buy one. Just the square edge of any piece of paper will make a nice L square that you can use to trace around so that you can get a really good accurate line. I'm drawing these, kind of eyeballing them, kind of freehand drawing them, but I would actually, if I would be doing this on a garment, I would use very accurate lines, very accurate measurements so that it comes out looking terrific. And then of course here again, after you have this all drawn, add your 5/8 seam allowance to it, and here we'd have a collar for that. Now these were bias collars, remember, so that means when you put this down on the fabric and cut it out, you're not going to cut this out on the straight. You do want to cut it out on the bias. And even though in these knits it wouldn't be necessary, it really would be nicer in a weave to have it done that way. The way you get the true bias on this, and maybe I'll cut out the rest of it a little bit better, the way you get the true bias is just to fold the straight lines so that when the crosswise, this would be the crosswise, when it meets the lengthwise, when this is folded around until they are completely parallel here at the top, what results here is a bias. And this is a 45-degree angle, and this is how you would want to cut it out of woven fabric. So we would use this for our grain arrow. Instead of having a grain arrow, you just use this fold. In fact, this is true of other things too. If you are using just any pattern piece, and of course they almost always say on that pattern piece, cut straight of grain or place this on straight of grain. But if for some reason you decided that with the garment you're making, it would work out better on the bias, do the same thing there. Just fold this so that what results here as you fold is an L square. If that's what results, then this would be a 45-degree angle. Make a little fold there and then use that fold for your grain arrow as you put it on the fabric and have it going straight up and down. So it would turn out true bias. It would turn out just perfectly that way. I think the more you understand patterns and how they work, the easier sewing of any sort is for you. And probably the less you have to rely on the guide sheet and can do a little bit more on your own. The more independent you get there and can do it on your own, probably the more fun you have with it if you don't have to completely follow all the directions and do things just as is expected of you. Now, if you'd use that same collar on the straight instead of cutting it on the bias, that also is a possibility with either wovens or knits. I have a coat back here where that's been done. Here's the coat, and this is simply a rectangle that's on this coat. When it's all open, you can see that this is simply a rectangle of fabric. It is cut on the straight, and I must frankly admit that the reason I cut this on the straight is because this was the only scrap I had left. I really didn't have enough room to cut it on the bias. Bias might have been better, but this actually is just cut on the straight. It is a complete rectangle, and then I rounded off these top corners as I hemmed under the one layer. So it does work on the straight. This one crunches up in place that way. So it is all right. You can do it that way. It just isn't the usual thing. Ordinarily, on woven fabric, it would be cut on the bias instead. Then another little division of collars that I wanted to show you are the fitted collars. And these fitted collars, we are going to need a bodice front and back, just as we have here. And we're going to have them pinned together, again, just as we have here. But what we're going to do that's a little bit different than this is, even though they are just overlapped 1.25 inches at the neckline, and of course this is the neckline because there's center front and here's center back, so they're only overlapped here 1.25 inches or exactly that. Out here we don't really want that overlap. We want a little bit larger one, and the reason for this is we are making a fitted collar. And if that fitted collar, picture a little Peter Pan collar, a sailor collar, any kind of a collar like this. If you're making that, you don't want anything to ripple around the outer edge. You want it to fit snugly down on your garment. And so we move this outer edge out here at the arm's eye just a little bit. We're going to overlap it slightly more. And if it does this, that means that we'll snug up that outer style line slightly, and you won't have any problem with it. Now, to make this collar, all I need to do is measure nothing, just trace around the neckline. So here's the center front. I'm going to trace around this neckline to the center back, and it comes out here. And just with that little neckline traced, I can then make a collar of whatever sort I want. Here are a couple of examples on this same little dress. These are, here's one. This one's a little Peter Pan collar. I'll take it off because it's actually a detachable one. But you can see that's just using the neckline as I have it here. I'll take the pin out so that you can see this might have been a slightly different size. It wasn't actually made from this pattern. But you can see by the time a seam allowance was built on, it must have been about the same size 4 child's pattern as what I'm using here, because I have the seam allowance here. So this is a Peter Pan collar. What I have done to this is simply draw a style line around like here so that it's rounded. If instead I wanted it squared off, here's one where it's squared off, and this one is sort of a little sailor collar. Okay, that means at the center front I simply squared this off and then brought it around, and in back it comes down to a square also. Here's the center back. So if I just bring this straight over, here would be the pattern for this, and this would be cut on the fold here. And then, of course, we'd have to have 2 layers of it. Not only would it be cut on the fold, but cut it twice so that you have an upper and an under collar. So this is a fitted collar. Another one, though, that I showed you earlier on this series that was a fitted collar that possibly you didn't realize at the time was this one with its shaggy edge. This is also a fitted collar, and this is kind of a fun one. This is, I'm going to show you how to make this because it comes off an expensive coat, but it's one that you probably won't be seeing in a pattern. It's this whole huge collar back here. Well, take a good look at this and I'll show you how to do it. See how it comes down to a low V in front, it comes down to about the waist. And the way you do that is this. We'd take that same little child's pattern, we would cut it down to a V here so that you could cut out that V neckline but a high neckline in front. And then you would just cut a collar that looks like this, a great big collar like that and all the way down to the waist and back. That simply, you can copy almost anything you see. Well, this turtleneck collar I'm wearing is nice and cozy on a cold day, but why is it so named? Because it works kind of like that turtle shell as he pulls in and out of it. Next time we're going to create a turtle quilt, one that folds up and stores into its own shell as we do some home decorating. See you then.